How diplomacy failed. Executive Order 9066. Diplomacy is defined as the conduct by government officials of negotiations and other relations between nations and handling people so there is little or no ill will. The Japanese government had been planning to control the southern resource area in Asia. They already had a treaty with Russia and controlled several countries by 1941. As the powers of Europe were already busy with a war of their own, their colonial powers could not effectively intervene. Negotiations between Japan and the U.S. were at a standstill. If the United States and Japan could not come to an agreement, Japan would perform its own version of the Blitzkrieg, a violent surprise offensive by mass air and ground forces, and eventually control the territories it wanted. In 1941, Yamamoto prepared for the Southern Operation, the Japanese conquest of the resource-abundant parts of Asia. One of the components of the Southern Operation was an attack on Pearl Harbor. If negotiations had not succeeded by November 23, 1941, the Japanese would resort to military action. The United States was aware that war was impending, but due to isolationism of the country, the question was how to enter into the war with Japan without declaring war on them. President Roosevelt was convinced that the United States would have to go to war with Japan, but the problem was how to convince Congress and the American people that war was justified. The U.S. government knew that the only way to enter the war was to have Japan make the first attack. How could we manipulate them into attacking without harming too many American citizens? During this time, Japanese American citizens led normal lives. They worked, went to school, attended church, and had friends. They had pretty simple lives and, like many other immigrants, tended to stay together as a people, in small communities. "We were a normal middle-class family," said Rosie Kakauchi of Las Vegas, Nevada in a 20-minute phone interview. "I was 16, living with my mom, dad, sister, and brother. We were shocked. I didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was. I felt like the enemy." On December 7, 1941, the Japanese led an air attack and bombed Pearl Harbor. Soon the United States government became suspicious of Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. The government was leery that Japanese Americans might be leaking information to the Japanese government and that they may assist the Japanese in another attack on the United States. American citizens became afraid of what their neighbors might be up to. The press began to publish anti-Japanese propaganda, and eventually the American people believed that the Japanese Americans were their enemy. Even though the military intelligence reported it was unnecessary to intern all Japanese Americans, on February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which stated that the military and other government officials were given the authority to remove and relocate any individuals who were seen as a threat to the United States military bases on the West Coast. After several proclamations, General DeWitt issued Civilian Exclusion Order, which ordered complete removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Regulations on internment were simply overlooked, and all persons of Japanese descent, immigrants and citizens, were forced to gather their families, sell or abandon their property and possessions, and report to assembly centers. They were not permitted to bring more than they could carry. Upon arrival at the assembly centers, each family was given an identification number and shown to a barrack for temporary housing until they were relocated to a more permanent camp. "It was a horrible experience," said Mrs. Kakauchi. "We had to sell everything my parents had worked for. We couldn't bring more than we could carry. We were lost and in the desert. The bright side was that we were all together." There were 10 permanent internment camps: Amachi, Gila, Heart Mountain, Jerome, Manzanar, Minidoka, Pauston, Rower, Topaz, and Tule Lake, which were surrounded by barbed wire fences and armed soldiers. These camps were located in harsh areas with extreme climates. There was no heat or air conditioning, and the few resources given to them were mostly used up by the soldiers. Life in the camps was poor and unsanitary. Groups of families were assigned to barracks, where each family was given a room to share. A 480 square foot space would be home for a family of 6. No apartment had running water, heating systems, or furniture. People were expected to carry on with their lives in these conditions until the war was over. Families were assigned to a mess hall to eat their meals. Mess halls were not large enough to feed everyone at the same time, which resulted in long lines. Some people waited for hours before they ate. Washrooms were small and unclean, with no privacy for the people. Even under the severe circumstances, the Japanese American people attempted to carry on with everyday life by building schools, forming their own small government, growing gardens, and working various other tasks to keep themselves busy. Mrs. Kakauchi stated, "As teenagers, we had few worries. My friend and I played softball and baseball with some of the women in the camp. Our team made a newspaper in Philadelphia, and we taught some of the Nisei boys how to dance. They were shy, and always asked us to be their dates to the dances held in the mess halls." Eventually, the military started to draft Japanese American internees to fight in the war against Japan. They were expected to fight for the country that stripped them of their rights. Resistors were convicted. Although it had only taken a very short time to move Japanese Americans to the internment camps, getting the internees out was a more difficult, time-consuming task. Beginning in late September of 1942, the relocating of Japanese American internees began, sending them to resettle in different states. It took almost 4 years to complete the task. Once they were out of the camps, they faced prejudices against their race, fears of being accepted, and the unknown of where they would live and what they would do for work. For those who were educated and psychologically equipped to take advantage of it, resettlement enabled them to break out of the restrictive employment patterns of the past. Unfortunately, some were unable to resettle. Because they were treated so poorly, many Japanese Americans renounced their American citizenship and moved to Japan. The Japanese American internment was a failure to diplomacy because it stripped these American citizens of their civil liberties without cause or trial. The government's success in interning the Japanese Americans demonstrates its power to manipulate American minds into believing that anyone of a certain race is a threat to society. Change did come, but it took 40 years for the government to admit the injustice of the internment and officially apologize. In 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was passed to rescind Executive Order 9066, and in 2003, the House Resolution 56 was introduced to bring recognition to this event by establishing National Remembrance Day. The government promised to educate Americans about what happened in order to prevent it from happening again. Innocent people were stripped of their rights as citizens of the United States and incarcerated because of their race. Shame was brought to the Japanese American citizens for a crime they didn't commit. More people should know about the Japanese American internment, because even with all of the laws and rights that we have, it could happen to any of us at any time.